deep in the Brazilian Amazon, where ancient trees stretch toward heaven and morning mist clings to emerald canopies. Dr. Helena Vasquez stood at the edge of what used to be her world. 5 years ago, illegal loggers burned her village to ash, killed her family, and left her for dead. The brilliant botanist and indigenous rights activist had everything stripped away in a single night of flames and gunfire. But Helena didn't just survive. She disappeared completely into the green heart of the jungle. For 5 years, the outside world assumed she was dead. Until last week, when NASA's satellite images captured something extraordinary. Massive geometric structures rising from the forest floor, surrounded by vegetation that shouldn't exist. Trees growing in perfect spirals, flowers blooming in impossible colors, and at the center of it all, a sprawling complex that defied explanation. The Brazilian government is mobilizing. International scientists are baffled. Environmental groups are in uproar, because somehow a woman who lost everything has built something that could revolutionize how humanity interacts with nature itself. But what exactly did Helena discover in those lost years, and why are powerful people willing to kill to keep it buried? Helena pressed her palm against the bark of a cecropia tree, feeling the familiar pulse of life beneath her fingertips. The tree responded with a subtle shift in its electromagnetic field, a language she had learned to read as clearly as Portuguese or her native Kayapo. Around her, the morning symphony of the rainforest played out in layers, the haunting calls of howler monkeys, the percussive drops of condensation from leaves 50 meters above, and underneath it all, the almost inaudible hum of communication between the plants themselves. She had discovered that hum 3 years ago, during the darkest period of her exile. Half dead from infected wounds, delirious with fever, she had collapsed beneath a strangler fig and prepared to die. But instead of claiming her, the forest had whispered its secrets. In her delirium, Helena heard what indigenous shamans had known for millennia, but science had dismissed as folklore. The rainforest was not just an ecosystem, but a vast neural network, a living consciousness that spanned continents. The revelation should have sounded like madness. Helena Vasquez had earned her doctorate from MIT, published papers in Nature, and spent a decade bridging Western science with traditional knowledge. She knew the difference between empirical observation and wishful thinking, but as her fever broke and her strength returned, the evidence became undeniable. The plants were communicating through chemical signals, electrical impulses, and fungal networks in ways that created something approaching collective intelligence. More importantly, they were willing to teach her. But it was the work happening within those living walls that would have astounded the scientific community. Helena had learned to accelerate plant growth through targeted electromagnetic stimulation, communicate with trees through modified chemical signals, and, most remarkably, convince different species to cooperate in ways that violated everything botanists thought they knew about competition and resource allocation. The spiral groves that had caught NASA's attention were perhaps her greatest achievement. By working with the forest's own communication networks, Helena had persuaded the trees to grow in mathematical patterns that maximized carbon absorption while creating microclimates perfect for endangered species. Each grove was a carefully orchestrated symphony of interdependence, producing more oxygen, storing more carbon, and supporting more biodiversity than equivalent areas of natural forest. She moved through her domain like a conductor guiding an orchestra, her presence registered and acknowledged by every plant within a 100-meter radius. A bromeliad adjusted its angle to catch morning light as she passed. Strangler fig roots shifted slightly to provide better footing. The forest itself was rolling out a carpet for its human collaborator. But Helena's peaceful morning was interrupted by a sound that didn't belong in her sanctuary, the distant thrum of helicopter rotors. She froze, every instinct screaming danger. In 5 years, no human had penetrated this deep into her territory. The few GPS coordinates that existed for this region were deliberately falsified, and the approaches were protected by carefully cultivated stretches of nearly impassable vegetation. As the sound grew closer, Helena felt the forest's alarm through her fingertips. Chemical warning signals cascaded from tree to tree, and she could almost taste the collective anxiety in the air. Somewhere above the canopy, strangers were approaching her world with unknown intentions. Elena closed her eyes and reached out through the network she had spent years learning to navigate. In seconds, her awareness expanded beyond her physical form, touching the consciousness of every major plant within a kilometer radius. Through their chemical sensors and electromagnetic fields, she began to map the intruder's approach. 3 helicopters, military-grade, armed, they had found her at last. Dr. Elena Vasquez squinted at the satellite image on her monitor, then rubbed her eyes and looked again. After 15 years analyzing deforestation patterns for the Amazon Conservation Institute, she thought she'd seen everything the jungle could throw at her. But this didn't make sense. The infrared data showed a perfect circle of unusual vegetation deep in the Mato Grosso, roughly 3 kilometers in diameter. What made it impossible was the rate of growth. Comparing images from just 6 months apart revealed an expansion that should have taken decades. The spectral analysis was even stranger. The chlorophyll signatures were off the charts, suggesting photosynthetic activity unlike anything in the scientific literature. "Miguel, come look at this," she called to her research partner. Miguel Santos wheeled his chair over, coffee mug in hand. "Please tell me it's not another illegal logging operation. I can't handle the paperwork today." "I wish it were that simple." Elena pulled up the comparative images. "Look at these coordinates. What do you see?" Miguel leaned forward, his weathered face creasing with concentration. After 30 years documenting the Amazon's destruction, he'd developed an eye for anomalies. That can't be right. What's the time frame on these?" 6 months. The growth rate is impossible. And look at this. Elena switched to the spectral analysis. The vegetation isn't matching any known species signatures. It's like something entirely new is growing out there. Equipment malfunction? I thought so too, but I've checked everything. Even requested verification from the European satellite network. Same results. Elena saved the files and leaned back. "There's something else. I ran a cross-reference on the coordinates." She pulled up another screen showing a digital map overlaid with tribal territory markers. A small red dot indicated a village called Yawanawa, right at the edge of the anomalous zone. "Wasn't there some controversy about this area a few years back?" Miguel's voice carried the weight of too many similar stories. Elena nodded grimly. "Nexus Mining Corporation. They got permits to extract rare earth minerals. The usual story, government officials paid off, environmental impact studies buried, indigenous rights ignored." She clicked through news articles from 5 years ago. The Yawanawa people fought it in court for months, but money talks louder than justice, Miguel finished. "What happened to the village?" "Officially, relocated to a government settlement 300 kilometers south. Unofficially," Elena's fingers paused over the keyboard. "There were reports of violence. Some villagers disappeared. The whole thing got buried when Nexus pulled out 6 months later, claiming the mineral deposits weren't economically viable." Miguel studied the satellite images again. "So Nexus destroys this village, then abandons the area, and now something impossible is growing there?" "It gets stranger. I pulled the historical data going back 10 years. The growth began exactly 18 months after Nexus left." Elena highlighted a timeline on her screen. Before that, normal rainforest. After Nexus pulled out, nothing for a while. Then this. She zoomed in on the center of the anomalous zone. The resolution wasn't perfect, but there appeared to be structures within the vegetation, geometric patterns too regular to be natural. "Those look almost like buildings," Miguel murmured. "Or temples. The patterns remind me of some of the archaeological sites we've documented." Elena enhanced the contrast, trying to make out more details. "But if someone's building something out there, where are the access roads? The supply lines? You can't construct anything significant in the middle of the Amazon without leaving traces." Miguel was quiet for a long moment, studying the data. "Elena, what if this isn't construction?" "What do you mean? What if it's cultivation? Look at these patterns again, but think agriculture, not architecture." Elena shifted her perspective, examining the geometric shapes with fresh eyes. They could be fields or gardens, arranged in precise mathematical spirals that seemed to follow principles she didn't recognize. But the growth rate is still impossible, and the spectral analysis suggests these aren't normal crops. She pulled up the biochemical data again. The nitrogen fixation rates alone would require soil conditions that don't exist naturally in this region. Unless someone figured out how to create those conditions, the implications hung in the air between them. Elena found herself thinking about the Yawanawa village, about the people who disappeared when their world was destroyed. Indigenous communities had been developing sophisticated agricultural techniques for thousands of years. Some tribes knew secrets about soil management and plant cultivation that modern science was only beginning to understand. "We need to get approval for a ground survey," Elena said finally. Miguel raised an eyebrow. "The Institute's budget is already stretched thin. They'll want more than satellite anomalies to justify an expedition into uncharted territory. Then we better find more evidence." Elena began downloading additional satellite data, expanding the search parameters. Because if someone really has discovered something revolutionary about plant growth in the Amazon, we need to document it before it disappears. Like so much else in the rainforest, she thought but didn't say, before someone with more money and fewer scruples decided it was worth taking. He adjusted his glasses and leaned closer, certain his eyes were playing tricks on him. The coordinates placed this deep in the Peruvian Amazon, roughly 200 kilometers from the nearest research station. According to the historical data, this area had been logged by Meridian Corporation 5 years ago, cleared down to bare earth for cattle ranching that never materialized. The satellite images from that time showed the familiar brown scar of industrial devastation. But now, something extraordinary had taken its place. Where clear-cut wasteland should have remained, an impossible garden bloomed. The vegetation wasn't just regrowing, it was thriving in patterns that defied everything Marcus knew about rainforest regeneration. Concentric circles of different tree species created mandala-like formations visible even from orbit. Streams had been redirected into spiraling waterways that caught and reflected sunlight like mirrors. Most puzzling of all, certain areas pulsed with an odd luminescence that the infrared sensors couldn't quite categorize. "Hey, Sarah," Marcus called to his colleague at the adjacent workstation. "Take a look at this." Dr. Sarah Okafor rolled her chair over, her expression shifting from casual interest to bewilderment as she studied the images. "That's not natural regrowth," she said immediately. "The symmetry, the species distribution, someone's cultivating this." "That's what I thought. But look at the timeline." Marcus pulled up the progression of images spanning 5 years. It started as random seedlings, completely chaotic. Then gradually, over months, the patterns began emerging. Whatever's happening there, it's been guided by someone who understands forest ecology better than anyone I've ever encountered. Sarah frowned at the data. "Any indigenous communities in that area?" "Not anymore." Marcus's voice carried a note of sadness. Meridian displaced several villages before the logging operation. Most of the people were relocated to urban settlements. The two scientists spent the next hour analyzing spectral data, trying to understand what they were seeing. The biodiversity readings were off the charts, species counts that exceeded even the most pristine sections of undisturbed rainforest. But it was the botanical arrangements that truly baffled them. Medicinal plants clustered in specific groupings, fruit trees formed natural pathways, nitrogen-fixing species were positioned with mathematical precision to optimize soil restoration. "I need to flag this for the conservation team," Sarah said, reaching for her phone. "Wait." Marcus caught her arm. "Look at the metadata on these images. They're classified under Meridian's monitoring contract." Sarah's face darkened as understanding dawned. "They're still tracking this area?" "Quarterly surveillance. Someone there has been watching this development for years and hasn't reported it." The implications hung heavy between them. Meridian Corporation had exclusive logging rights to vast sections of Peruvian rainforest, but they also held lucrative bioprospecting licenses. the right to harvest and patent any commercially valuable biological discoveries. If they'd found something significant in this mysterious garden, they would exploit it ruthlessly. Marcus pulled up Meridian's corporate filings, cross-referencing them with patent applications. "Here," he said, pointing to a series of recent submissions. "They've been filing preliminary patents on novel plant compounds. Look at the source coordinates." The patents covered everything from cancer-fighting alkaloids to revolutionary soil enhancement bacteria. Each filing cited proprietary cultivation sites in the Amazon basin, but the coordinates matched perfectly with the anomalous garden on Marcus's screen. "They're harvesting from this place," Sarah whispered. "But who's growing it for them?" The question haunted Marcus as he continued his analysis. The sophisticated agricultural techniques on display suggested deep knowledge of indigenous farming methods, but amplified to an almost supernatural degree. Traditional forest gardens, created by native peoples, were marvels of sustainable agriculture, but nothing in the anthropological literature described anything approaching this scale or complexity. As the hours passed, more details emerged from the high-resolution imagery. Hidden among the canopy, he spotted structures that looked like elevated platforms connected by rope bridges. Water collection systems that channeled rainwater through elaborate filtration gardens. Even what appeared to be a sophisticated composting operation that transformed forest debris into rich, dark soil amendments. Someone was living in that impossible garden. More than living, they were orchestrating a resurrection of the rainforest that transcended anything science had deemed possible. Marcus saved his analysis to an encrypted drive and shut down his workstation. The discovery was too significant to remain buried in Terrascope's routine monitoring reports, but releasing it publicly would certainly destroy whatever delicate ecosystem had taken root in that remote corner of the Amazon. As he gathered his things, one thought echoed in his mind. Whoever had created this miracle was about to face the full attention of forces that had already destroyed their world once before. The satellite images spread across Dr. Sarah Chen's desk like pieces of a puzzle that defied logic. She adjusted her reading glasses and leaned closer to the high-resolution printouts, her coffee growing cold as she studied the anomalous formations captured from orbit. In her 15 years analyzing Amazon deforestation patterns, she had never seen anything like this. The coordinates placed the phenomenon deep in the Acre region, roughly 200 kilometers from where the last recorded villages had been displaced 5 years ago. What the satellite showed made her question whether the equipment was malfunctioning, where there should have been either virgin rainforest or the characteristic scars of illegal logging. Instead, there appeared to be something entirely different, geometric patterns of vegetation that seemed to pulse with an almost artificial vibrancy. Sarah pulled up the temporal analysis on her computer screen. The time-lapse satellite data showed the area's transformation over the past 18 months. Initially, it had appeared as ordinary jungle canopy. Then, gradually, sections began to change. The vegetation grew denser, forming spiraling patterns that radiated outward from a central point. Most disturbing was the growth rate. What should have taken decades of natural forest development had occurred in less than 2 years. Her colleague Marcus knocked and entered without waiting for permission, a habit that normally irritated her but which she barely noticed today. "You missed the morning briefing," he said, then stopped when he saw her expression. "What's got you looking like you've seen a ghost?" "Look at this," Sarah said, pointing to the images. "Acre region, Sector 7G. Tell me what you see." Marcus bent over the photographs, his brow furrowing. "Some kind of cultivation pattern? But that's impossible. There are no settlements in that area. The mining consortium cleared out the last villages years ago, and it's been designated uninhabitable since then." "That's what I thought too." Sarah clicked through a series of enhanced images. "But look at the spectral analysis. The chlorophyll concentrations are off the charts. This vegetation is photosynthesizing at rates we've never recorded in natural forests. And the geometric precision, it's like someone designed it." The patterns were undeniably deliberate. Concentric circles of different tree species created a mandala-like formation spanning nearly 3 square kilometers. Waterways had been redirected to flow in spirals between the planted sections, creating an intricate irrigation system that fed the entire area. Most remarkable were the clearings, not the brutal scars left by machinery, but perfectly circular spaces that served some unknown purpose. Could be some kind of government reforestation project, Marcus suggested, though his tone suggested he didn't believe it himself. Sarah shook her head. I've checked with every environmental agency, every NGO, every research institution in Brazil. Nobody knows anything about this. And look here. She pointed to a section of the imagery that showed structures within the tree patterns. Those aren't just plants. There are buildings, or at least structures of some kind. But they're integrated into the forest canopy so seamlessly that you can barely distinguish them. The more she studied the images, the more convinced she became that this represented something unprecedented. The forest wasn't just regrowing, it was being actively cultivated by someone with an extraordinary understanding of ecosystem dynamics. Whoever was responsible had created what appeared to be a sustainable paradise in one of the most remote regions on Earth. We need to contact the Brazilian authorities, Marcus said. If there are people living out there illegally... No. Sarah's response was immediate and firm. Not yet. Think about what happened to the indigenous communities in that region. TexCorp's mining operations displaced thousands of people, destroyed entire cultures. If survivors have managed to create something like this, the last thing they need is government interference. She thought about the reports she'd read 5 years ago, the testimonies of violence and environmental destruction that had accompanied the mining expansion. Entire villages had vanished overnight, their residents scattered or worse. The official reports claimed voluntary relocation, but the indigenous rights organizations told a different story, one of forced displacement, cultural genocide, and families torn apart. So, what are you suggesting? Marcus asked. Sarah gathered the satellite images into a neat stack. I'm suggesting we do what scientists are supposed to do. We investigate, quietly. We gather more data, maybe plan a discreet reconnaissance mission. If there really are people out there who've managed to create this kind of sustainable habitat, we need to understand how they did it. This could revolutionize everything we know about rainforest restoration. As Marcus left her office, Sarah remained staring at the images. Something about the patterns nagged at her, a familiarity she couldn't quite place. She had spent years studying indigenous agricultural techniques, the sophisticated forest management systems that had sustained Amazonian peoples for centuries before colonization. But this was different. This was those traditional methods elevated to an almost supernatural level of precision and effectiveness. Deep in the Amazon, someone was proving that the forest could be more than saved. It could be reborn. The helicopter's rotors churned through humid air as Dr. Elena Vasquez pressed her face against the reinforced window, watching the endless canopy of green rush beneath them. 3 days had passed since the emergency board meeting at Meridian Industries, and she still couldn't shake the memory of those satellite images, the impossible geometric patterns carved into the heart of the Amazon, too precise to be natural, too vast to be human. 20 minutes out, the pilot's voice crackled through her headset. Marcus Chen, sitting across from her, looked up from his tablet where he'd been reviewing topographical maps for the 100th time. The indigenous rights groups are already mobilizing, Marcus said, his weathered face creased with concern. 3 separate organizations have filed injunctions to halt any corporate activity in the region. Elena nodded, though her attention remained fixed on the jungle below. As Meridian's head of environmental assessment, she'd spent 15 years evaluating potential mining sites, but this felt different. The anomaly wasn't just geologically fascinating, it was terrifying in its implications. Satellite thermal imaging showed temperature variations that defied explanation, and preliminary spectral analysis suggested mineral compositions that shouldn't exist in nature. Dr. Vasquez, the pilot's voice interrupted her thoughts. "We've got company." "That's Harrison's transport," Marcus muttered. "Bastard couldn't wait for our preliminary report." James Harrison, Meridian's VP of Operations, had made his position clear during the board meeting. Secure the site first, ask questions later. Elena had argued for a careful scientific approach, but Harrison's promises of unprecedented mineral wealth had swayed the board. Now both teams were racing toward the same destination, each with radically different agendas. The jungle began to change beneath them. Where dense canopy should have stretched unbroken, Elena could see clearings, not the random gaps created by fallen trees, but deliberate spaces arranged in patterns that made her pulse quicken. As they drew closer, the true scope of the anomaly became visible. "Jesus Christ," Marcus whispered. Carved into the jungle floor was a series of concentric circles, each ring wider than a football field. The outer circles appeared to be cultivated gardens of some kind, with crops growing in perfect geometric arrangements. The inner circles showed what looked like structures, not buildings exactly, but organic formations that seemed to blend architecture with living vegetation. "Set us down on the northern perimeter," Elena instructed the pilot. "Away from the main formations." The helicopter touched down in a small clearing, and Elena immediately felt the oppressive weight of the jungle humidity. The air was thick with the scent of rich earth and growing things, but underneath lay something else, a strange, almost metallic tang that made her nostrils burn. Marcus began unpacking their equipment while Elena walked to the edge of the clearing. Through the trees, she could see the outer ring of the anomaly perhaps half a mile away. The vegetation there looked different, lusher, more vibrant, as if it were thriving in ways that normal rainforest plants couldn't. Elena Marcus's voice carried a note of urgency. "You need to see this." She turned to find him crouched beside a tree at the clearing's edge, his geological scanner in hand. The device was emitting a steady beeping sound that grew more rapid as he moved it closer to the tree's base. "Radiation?" Elena asked. "No, mineral concentrations. The soil here." Marcus looked up at her, his eyes wide. "Elena, this is impossible. I'm reading platinum, rhodium, rare earth elements. Concentrations that would require millions of years of geological processes." Elena knelt beside him and took a sample of the dark earth. It felt different beneath her fingers, almost electrical. "How fresh are these readings?" "That's the thing. The isotope ratios suggest this transformation is recent, very recent, as in within the last 5 years. The sound of rotors grew louder as Harrison's helicopter approached their position. Elena stood, brushing soil from her hands, and felt a chill despite the tropical heat. 5 years ago, according to the preliminary reports, this region had shown no unusual activity. Standard rainforest, standard geology, nothing to attract corporate attention. What had changed? And more importantly, who or what was responsible for creating this impossible garden in the heart of the Amazon? Through the trees, Elena caught a flash of movement, a human figure watching them from the edge of the anomaly. For just a moment, their eyes seemed to meet across the distance. Then the figure melted back into the verdant geometry of the jungle, leaving Elena with the unsettling certainty that they were not alone, and that their presence here had already been noted. "First time in Brazil?" asked Dr. Sarah Brennan, the ethnobotanist who'd been assigned to his expedition. Her weathered hands clutched a worn leather journal filled with sketches of rare plant specimens. Marcus nodded, still studying the data streams. "Corporate espionage usually keeps me in air-conditioned offices, not rainforests." He paused, remembering why he'd taken this assignment. "Though, after what I uncovered about Titan Industries, I needed something that felt like redemption." Sarah's expression darkened. "Titan's the company that destroyed the Uruna settlement 5 years ago, isn't it? Poisoned their water, bulldozed their sacred sites?" Among other atrocities. Marcus closed the laptop as the plane touched down with a jolt. "The files I leaked were just the beginning. There's something else they've been hiding, something connected to that area." 3 hours later, they stood on the dock in Manaus, loading supplies into a motorized canoe while their guide, Roberto Santos, checked the engine. Roberto had worked these waters for 30 years, his mahogany skin bearing the scars of countless encounters with the jungle's less forgiving inhabitants. "You sure about these coordinates?" Roberto asked, squinting at Marcus's printout. "That region, it's different now. Locals won't go there anymore." "Different how?" Sarah leaned forward, her scientific curiosity piqued. Roberto spat into the dark water. "Stories mostly. They say the trees grow wrong there. Birds won't land. And the air," he shook his head. "They say it makes you dream strange dreams." Marcus felt a chill despite the oppressive humidity. The satellite imagery had shown something vast spreading through that section of rainforest. Not deforestation, but the opposite. An explosion of green so intense it registered as thermal anomalies from space. As they motored up the Rio Negro, the city's chaos faded into memory. The jungle pressed in from both sides, a wall of green punctuated by the occasional flash of brilliant plumage or the splash of a river dolphin. Sarah documented everything, her trained eye cataloguing species most people would never notice. "Look at this," she murmured, pointing to a cluster of vines draped between massive cecropia trees. "Those leaf patterns, I've never seen anything like them." Marcus followed her gaze. The vegetation did seem unusually lush, almost luminescent in the filtered sunlight, but it was Roberto's behavior that concerned him more. Their guide had grown increasingly quiet as they traveled deeper into the jungle, constantly checking his GPS as if the familiar waterways had somehow shifted when he wasn't looking. The electromagnetic signatures were stronger here, pulsing in rhythms that seemed almost biological. More disturbing were the atmospheric readings. Oxygen levels that would be normal at sea level, not deep in the jungle where plant respiration typically created more complex gas mixtures. "Marcus," Sarah's voice carried a note of excitement mixed with unease. "You need to see this." She held up a leaf sample, its surface covered in what looked like geometric patterns. Under magnification, the patterns revealed themselves as cellular structures, unlike anything in botanical literature. "This isn't natural evolution," she whispered. "This is directed, purposeful, as if someone was teaching the plants to grow differently." A sound drifted through the darkness. Not quite human, not quite animal. Roberto jerked awake, his hand instinctively reaching for the machete at his belt. "We should have waited," he muttered. "Should have brought more people." The sound came again, closer this time. It resembled singing, but in no language Marcus recognized. The melody seemed to make the very air shimmer, and he noticed their electronic equipment beginning to emit soft harmonic responses. "Pack everything," Roberto commanded, suddenly decisive. "We leave first light, but we don't go deeper. This place, it's protected now." "Protected by what?" Marcus demanded. Roberto's eyes reflected the lamplight like an animal's. "By someone who knows these trees better than we know ourselves. Someone who disappeared into this jungle and came back as something else." As if summoned by his words, a figure emerged from the tree line. At first, Marcus thought it was a trick of shadows and lamplight, but as his eyes adjusted, he saw her clearly. A woman whose dark hair was woven with living vines, whose skin seemed to pulse with the same bioluminescent patterns they'd observed in the plant samples. She studied them with eyes that held the depth of the Amazon itself, then spoke in accented English. "You're looking for answers about Titan Industries, about what they destroyed and what grew from those ashes." She smiled, and Marcus felt the jungle itself listening. "I'm Ayana Delgado, and I've been waiting for you." The helicopter's rotors cut through the humid air as Dr. Sarah Chen pressed her face against the window, watching the endless green canopy roll beneath them. 3 days had passed since the satellite images first crossed her desk at the Environmental Research Institute, and she still couldn't shake the feeling that what they were pursuing defied every law of botanical science she knew. There, Marcus pointed ahead, his weathered finger tapping the glass. The pilot, a grizzled local named Santos, had been flying these routes for 20 years and claimed he'd never seen anything like the anomaly they were seeking. Sarah's breath caught as the forest opened into a massive clearing that shouldn't exist. Where Valdez Industries had once operated their illegal mining operation, where Kira Tuxa's village had stood 5 years ago, something extraordinary had taken root. The cleared land, which should have remained barren for decades, was now covered in vegetation so dense and vibrant it seemed to pulse with life from above. But it wasn't just the accelerated growth that made Sarah's hands tremble as she adjusted her camera. The plants below formed patterns, spirals and geometric shapes that suggested intention, intelligence, design. The satellite had captured it, but seeing it with her own eyes sent a chill down her spine despite the tropical heat. "Can you set us down near the perimeter?" she called to Santos over the engine noise. The pilot shook his head. "Too dense, Doctora, but there's a clearing about 1/2 kilometer south. We can hike in." As they descended, Sarah caught glimpses of something else that made her pulse quicken. Structures. Not the corrugated metal and concrete of the mining operation, but organic formations that seemed to grow from the earth itself, curved walls of interwoven branches and vines, dome-like shelters that appeared both ancient and impossibly new. The helicopter touched down in a clearing scarred by old machinery tracks, the last remnants of Valdez Industries' hasty retreat after the massacre. Sarah had read the reports, seen the photographs of bodies left behind when international pressure finally forced the company out. 17 indigenous people killed, dozens more scattered to other regions. One woman had simply vanished, Kira Tuxa, daughter of the village shaman, whose body was never found. The oppressive humidity hit them like a wall as they stepped onto the forest floor. Sarah's equipment felt impossibly heavy in the thick air, but she pressed forward, following Marcus toward the anomalous growth. Her mentor moved with surprising agility for a man in his 60s, his decades of field research evident in every careful step. The transition was abrupt and startling. One moment they were walking through typical secondary growth forest, sparse and struggling in the depleted soil left by the mining operation. The next, they were surrounded by jungle so lush and vibrant it seemed to glow with its own inner light. "This is impossible," Sarah whispered, kneeling to examine a massive fern whose fronds stretched 15 feet above her head. "These species, some of them shouldn't even exist in this region. And this growth rate." She pulled out her soil testing kit, her scientific training taking over despite her amazement. Marcus was photographing a tree whose trunk was easily 8 feet in diameter, its bark marked with spiral patterns that seemed almost carved. "Sarah, look at this," he called softly. "These markings, they're not natural scarring." As they moved deeper into the anomalous forest, the sense of intentional design became overwhelming. Paths seemed to flow naturally between the massive trees, leading them inexorably toward the center of the clearing. The air itself felt different here, cleaner somehow, charged with an energy that made Sarah's skin tingle. Then they heard it. A low humming that seemed to come from the earth itself, rising and falling in a rhythm that felt almost like breathing. Sarah's instruments couldn't locate the source, but the sound grew stronger as they approached what appeared to be the heart of the growth. In a circular clearing perhaps 50 meters across, they found her. The woman sat motionless in the center of an intricate mandala of flowers and ferns, her back against a tree so massive it dwarfed everything around it. Her dark hair had grown long, and was woven with vines and small blooms. Her skin bore intricate patterns of what looked like living tattoos, green lines that pulsed faintly with the same rhythm as the humming around them. Her eyes opened as they approached, and Sarah felt her breath catch. They were the deep brown of rich earth, but flecked with green that seemed to shift and move like sunlight through leaves. "You've come," the woman said, her voice carrying the cadence of the forest itself. "I've been waiting." Sarah found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "Kira Tuxa?" The woman smiled, and as she did, the patterns on her skin brightened, and the forest around them seemed to respond, leaves rustling without wind, flowers blooming visibly before their eyes. "That was my name," she said, rising gracefully to her feet. "But I am something new now, something that was always meant to be." The helicopter's rotors carved through humid air as Marcus Chen pressed his face against the window, watching the endless green canopy rush beneath them. 3 days had passed since the satellite data reached his desk, 3 sleepless nights spent analyzing impossible images that defied every principle of botanical science he'd learned in his 20-year career. "There!" he shouted over the engine noise, pointing toward a clearing that seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly quality. "Set us down in that opening." The pilot, a weathered man named Santos, who'd been flying researchers into the Amazon for decades, shook his head grimly. "That area is forbidden, senor. The locals, they say it belongs to the forest spirits now." "Superstition," Marcus muttered, though his hands trembled as he adjusted his equipment pack. The satellite images showed vegetation growth patterns that shouldn't exist, plants that appeared to be growing at impossible rates, creating geometric formations that suggested deliberate cultivation rather than natural growth. As the helicopter touched down, Marcus felt the jungle's oppressive embrace immediately. The air hung thick with moisture and the symphony of a million unseen creatures. Behind him, his research assistant, Elena Vasquez, emerged with their scientific instruments, her young face tight with excitement and fear. "The readings are already off the charts," she whispered, consulting her tablet. "The soil composition here shows mineral concentrations I've never seen before, and the oxygen levels—" A branch snapped somewhere in the dense foliage surrounding their landing site. Both scientists froze, straining to listen above the helicopter's dying engine. Santos remained in his seat, fingers drumming nervously on the controls. "1 hour," he called out. "Then we leave, with or without you." Marcus nodded curtly and shouldered his pack. The satellite images had shown the anomalous growth patterns approximately 2 kilometers northeast of this clearing. As they pushed into the jungle, following Elena's GPS coordinates, the very air seemed to thicken around them. The plants here were wrong. Marcus had spent his career studying tropical botany, but the specimens surrounding them displayed characteristics that challenged fundamental understanding. Vines hung in perfect spirals, their leaves exhibiting color variations that shifted subtly as clouds passed overhead. Flowers bloomed in mathematical sequences, their petals arranged in Fibonacci patterns so precise they seemed almost artificial. "Professor?" Elena's voice carried a note of awe. "Look at this." She knelt beside a massive tree whose bark displayed intricate carved symbols, or what appeared to be carvings, until Marcus examined them more closely. The markings seemed to have grown naturally into the wood, as if the tree itself had developed a written language. "Indigenous symbols," he murmured, running his fingers along the raised patterns. "But these aren't carved, they're part of the tree's natural growth." A sound echoed through the jungle then, not the call of any bird or animal Marcus recognized, but something that seemed almost musical, almost human. Elena grabbed his arm, her scientific composure cracking. "Someone's out there," she whispered. They pressed deeper into the jungle, following the sound. The vegetation grew increasingly unusual with each step. Plants that should have taken decades to mature towered above them, with trunks barely thick enough to support their height. Flowers bloomed and closed in rhythmic cycles that seemed to respond to their presence. The musical sound grew stronger, more complex. It carried harmonies that suggested multiple voices, though the jungle around them appeared empty of human life. Marcus felt his rational mind struggling to process what his senses reported. This wasn't natural evolution. It was something else entirely. Then they saw her. She stood in a clearing where impossible plants formed living architecture, walls of interwoven branches that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns, trees that curved and twisted into shelter-like formations. Her dark hair hung in intricate braids adorned with flowers that seemed to glow with their own inner light. She wore simple clothing that appeared to be woven from plant fibers, but her eyes held depths that spoke of profound transformation. "Dr. Chen," she said, her voice carrying the same musical quality they'd been following. "You've come to study the impossible." Marcus felt his throat constrict. This woman's face had been in the corporate files Elena had accessed, the indigenous rights activist who'd vanished 5 years ago after Meridian Industries destroyed her village. But the person before them seemed fundamentally changed, as if the jungle itself had remade her into something new. "Ayana Delgado," he managed. "You're supposed to be dead." She smiled, and around them the plants seemed to respond, their bioluminescent patterns brightening. "Death and rebirth take many forms in the Amazon, Doctor. You've seen what grows here now. The question is whether you're prepared to understand what it means." The jungle fell silent except for their breathing and the distant thrum of the waiting helicopter. Marcus realized that everything he thought he knew about life, science, and the natural world was about to change forever. The helicopter's rotors cut through the humid morning air as Marcus Chen adjusted his headset and studied the coordinates on his tablet. Below them, the Amazon stretched endlessly in every direction, a green carpet broken only by the serpentine curves of muddy rivers. He'd made this journey dozens of times for Meridian Industries, but never with such specific instructions to find someone who supposedly didn't want to be found. 5 minutes out, the pilot's voice crackled through the comm system. Marcus nodded, his stomach tightening with each passing mile. The satellite images that had crossed his desk 3 weeks ago still haunted him. Impossible geometric patterns carved into the jungle canopy, structures that defied explanation, and at the center of it all, a heat signature that suggested a thriving settlement where none should exist. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was searching for Ayana Santos, the same woman whose village Meridian had displaced to build their processing facility. He'd been a junior engineer then, following orders, telling himself the relocation packages were generous and that progress demanded sacrifice. Now, as head of environmental assessment, he carried the weight of those decisions differently. There, the pilot pointed ahead. "That clearing, Jesus," the pilot whispered. "How long did this take to build?" "According to our timeline, maybe 4 years." Marcus's voice was barely audible over the rotors. "But this looks like it's been here for centuries." As they descended toward a natural landing area at the settlement's edge, Marcus spotted movement in the trees. Figures emerged from the shadows, not the scattered survivors he'd expected, but a thriving community of at least 50 people, many of whom he recognized as former residents of the displaced villages along the Orinoco tributary. The helicopter touched down in a clearing where wildflowers had been carefully cultivated to form intricate patterns. Marcus stepped out, his boots sinking slightly into the rich earth, and was immediately struck by the sound, or rather the quality of sound. The usual cacophony of jungle noise was still there, but it felt orchestrated, harmonious in a way that made his skin prickle. "Dr. Chen." The voice came from behind him. He turned to find Ayana Santos emerging from what appeared to be a solid wall of vegetation. She looked nothing like the broken woman who had fled into the jungle 5 years ago. Her hair was longer, woven with small bones and bright feathers. Her skin had been marked with intricate patterns that seemed to shift in the dappled sunlight. But it was her eyes that truly unsettled him. They held a depth that seemed to contain the forest itself. "Miss Santos," he struggled to maintain his professional composure. "I'm here representing Meridian Industries. We need to discuss your situation here." She smiled, and the expression was neither friendly nor hostile. "You mean you've finally noticed what we've been building? The satellite images are concerning. This level of development requires environmental impact studies, permits." "From whom?" Her interruption was gentle but firm. "This land was never legally Meridian's to begin with. Your company's title to our ancestral territory was based on forged documents and bribed officials." Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks. "That's a serious accusation. It's a serious crime." Ayana gestured toward the magnificent structures surrounding them. "But we're not interested in legal battles anymore. We've moved beyond that." As she spoke, Marcus became aware of other presences around them. Children peered down from platforms high above, their faces painted with the same shifting patterns as Ayana's. Adults moved through the settlement with a grace that seemed almost choreographed, tending gardens that hung impossibly in mid-air and working on structures that appeared to grow rather than be built. "How is this possible?" Marcus asked, his scientific mind struggling to process what he was seeing. "The engineering alone? There are older forms of engineering than what they teach in your universities," Ayana said. "The forest has been teaching us." She led him deeper into the settlement, past pools of water that reflected the canopy above in impossible detail and workshops where people shaped living wood with their bare hands. The air itself felt different here, charged with potential, alive in ways that made Marcus's instruments flicker and dance. "Why did you come, Dr. Chen?" Ayana stopped beside a massive cecropia tree whose trunk had been shaped into a natural amphitheater. "Your company already has what it wanted from us." Marcus hesitated, then pulled out his tablet and showed her the satellite progression images. "Because this is spreading. Your settlement is expanding at a rate of approximately 2 acres per month, and the forest around it is changing in ways we don't understand." The canopy above them had grown so thick that daylight filtered through in scattered golden coins, creating a cathedral of green shadows. Dr. Sarah Chen wiped sweat from her forehead as she checked her GPS coordinates for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. The device showed they were close, impossibly close, to the anomaly that had appeared on the satellite images. "The air tastes different here," Marcus whispered, his camera hanging silent around his neck. Even he seemed reluctant to disturb whatever sacred space they were entering. Sarah nodded, though she couldn't articulate what her scientist's mind was detecting. The humidity carried unfamiliar scents, not just the usual decomposition and growth of rainforest, but something else, something that made her skin tingle with electricity she couldn't explain. Their Kayapo guide, Rayoni, had stopped speaking entirely 3 hours ago. He moved through the undergrowth like a ghost, occasionally touching certain trees with reverence that bordered on fear. When Sarah had tried to ask him questions, he'd simply shaken his head and pointed forward. The forest floor beneath their feet had been changing gradually. What started as typical jungle terrain, fallen logs, thick leaf litter, tangled roots, had given way to something more organized. The trees seemed planted in subtle patterns. Vines grew in spirals that were too perfect to be natural. Even the bird calls had shifted to harmonies that reminded Sarah of music rather than random forest sounds. "Jesus Christ!" Marcus breathed, stopping so suddenly that Sarah nearly collided with him. Ahead, the jungle opened into a clearing that defied everything Sarah knew about rainforest ecology. The trees formed a perfect circle, their trunks impossibly straight and uniform, reaching toward a canopy that created a natural dome. But it was what grew in the center that made Sarah's scientific worldview crumble. A single massive tree rose from the clearing's heart, but calling it a tree felt inadequate. Its trunk spiraled upward like DNA made flesh, covered in bark that seemed to pulse with bioluminescent veins. Fruit hung from its branches, not the typical offerings of Amazon flora, but perfectly spherical orbs that glowed with soft, shifting colors. The air around it shimmered with what looked like heat waves, but the temperature was cool. "The satellite images didn't capture this," Sarah whispered, pulling out her equipment with trembling hands. "The luminescence, the way it moves. It's breathing," Marcus said, raising his camera despite the tremor in his voice. "The whole tree is breathing." Sarah's instruments were going haywire. Her electromagnetic field detector screamed with readings that shouldn't exist in nature. The air ionization levels suggested they were standing in the middle of an electrical storm, yet the sky above was clear. Most disturbing of all, her Geiger counter was clicking, not dangerously high, but with a steady rhythm that matched the tree's apparent pulse. "This shouldn't be possible," she muttered, recording readings that would be dismissed as equipment failure by any peer review. The energy output alone would require. A figure stepped out from behind the great tree. But it was her eyes that made Sarah's heart skip. They held depths that seemed to contain the wisdom of the forest itself, along with a sadness so profound it was almost crushing. This was Elena Vasquez. Had to be. But she was transformed into something beyond the mining engineer who'd vanished 5 years ago. "You've come far to find something that was never lost," Elena said, her voice carrying the musical quality of wind through leaves. Marcus's camera clicked once before he seemed to think better of it, lowering the device with uncharacteristic restraint. "Elena Vasquez?" Sarah stepped forward, her scientific mind cataloguing impossible details. The woman's clothing appeared to be woven from plant fibers that shifted color with her movements. Flowers bloomed and died in her hair as Sarah watched. "We've been looking for you. Have you?" Elena tilted her head, and Sarah could swear she heard the great tree's pulse quicken. "Or have you been looking for this?" She gestured toward the luminescent giant behind her. "Both," Sarah admitted. "The satellite detected something extraordinary. We had to investigate." Elena's laugh was like water over stones. "Extraordinary. Such a small word for what you're witnessing." She placed her palm against the tree's trunk, and the bioluminescent veins flared brighter. "This is what your kind destroyed, and this is what I've spent 5 years learning to rebuild." The tree's glow intensified, and Sarah felt something shift in the air around them, a presence vast and ancient awakening to their intrusion. Whatever Elena had discovered or become, Sarah realized they were standing at the threshold of knowledge that could reshape humanity's understanding of life itself. The helicopter's rotors churned through morning mist as Yara pressed her face to the small window, watching the endless green canopy roll beneath them. Dr. Elena Vasquez sat across from her, clutching a tablet displaying the latest satellite images. The geometric patterns were more pronounced now, spreading outward like neural pathways through the forest floor. "The growth rate is unprecedented," Elena murmured, her voice barely audible over the engine noise. "Whatever's happening down there, it's accelerating." Marcus Chen leaned forward from the pilot's seat. "ETA 15 minutes to the coordinates. But I'm telling you, there's nowhere to land in that sector. We'll have to rope down." Yara's stomach tightened. 5 years of searching, 5 years of following fragmented leads and whispered stories from river traders and displaced tribes. Now, finally, they were closing in on Kaya's location, or what remained of her, the woman who had vanished after watching Petromax destroy everything she held sacred. "There," Elena pointed at her screen. "See how the patterns intersect? It's almost like a mandala, but organic, living." The helicopter banked sharply, and through the canopy gaps, Yara caught her first glimpse of something that shouldn't exist. The trees below weren't just growing, they were arranged. Massive cecropia and mahogany specimens formed concentric circles around a central clearing, their branches intertwined in impossible spirals that seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. "Jesus Christ," Marcus breathed. "What is that?" In the center of the formation, a structure rose from the forest floor. It wasn't built, it was grown. Vines, thick as telephone poles, twisted upward in helical patterns, supporting platforms of living wood. Flowers the size of satellite dishes bloomed in brilliant reds and golds, their petals seeming to track the helicopter's movement like eyes. Elena's fingers flew across her tablet, taking measurements. "The biomass density here is off the charts. This represents decades of growth compressed into 5 years, Yara finished quietly. "She's been here 5 years. As they descended, more details emerged. Streams had been redirected to flow in perfect spirals around the structure. Gardens of medicinal plants grew in precise geometric arrangements that Yara recognized from her grandmother's teachings, patterns that promoted harmony between species, that encouraged symbiotic growth. But this was those patterns amplified beyond anything the old ways had imagined. Marcus found a small clearing 50 meters away and set the helicopter down with practiced precision. The moment the rotors stopped, the jungle's voice rushed in, but it was wrong. Instead of the chaotic symphony Yara expected, she heard something like music. Bird calls that harmonized perfectly with insect drones, the whisper of wind through leaves that seemed almost melodic. They unloaded their equipment in tense silence. Elena's scientific instruments beeped constantly, registering atmospheric anomalies and electromagnetic fluctuations that made no sense. The air itself felt different, thicker, more alive, crackling with potential. "Stay close," Yara warned as they began hiking toward the central structure. "If this is Kaya's doing, she won't welcome corporate scientists with open arms." The path appeared before them as they walked, vines sliding aside with liquid grace, branches lifting to create archways. Elena documented everything, her excitement barely contained despite the obvious danger. "The level of coordination required for this," she whispered. "It's like the forest has developed a nervous system. The plants are communicating in real time, responding to our presence." They emerged into the central clearing, and Yara's breath caught. The structure towered above them, easily 100 feet tall, its living walls pulsing with bioluminescent veins. But it was the figure standing on the lowest platform that made her heart race. Kaya had changed. Her skin bore intricate patterns of what looked like tattoos, but as they watched, the designs shifted and flowed like living things. Her hair had grown long and wild, threaded with flowering vines that bloomed and closed in slow cycles. When she turned to face them, her eyes held depths that seemed to contain the wisdom of the entire forest. "Yara Ocelotl." Kaya's voice carried perfectly across the clearing despite the distance, rich with harmonics that seemed to resonate in the bones. "The jaguar returns to the heart of the green world. My family is not gone." Kaya gestured to the living cathedral around them. "They speak through every leaf, every root, every breath of wind. Petromax thought they could silence us with their machines and their poison. They were wrong." Elena moved closer to one of the supporting vines, her instruments registering impossible readings. "The cellular structure, it's like nothing I've ever seen." "How did you—" Kaya's gaze shifted to the scientist, and suddenly every flower in the clearing turned to face Elena like a crowd of watchful sentinels. "You work for them, the destroyers." The accusation hung in the air like a physical weight, and Yara realized they had walked into something far more dangerous than they had imagined. The helicopter's rotors cut through the humid air as Maya watched the canopy rush beneath them, her heart pounding with each mile that brought them closer to home. Beside her, Dr. Chen clutched his tablet displaying the satellite images that had started this entire journey. The impossible spiraling growth deep in the Amazon that defied every law of botany he knew. "There," Maya pointed through the cockpit window. "Set us down in that clearing." The pilot, a weathered Brazilian named Santos, whom Chen had hired in Manaus, shook his head. "Too small, trees too close, we crash for sure." Maya studied the narrow gap in the canopy below. It would be tight, but she'd seen Santos navigate worse approaches during their 3-day journey deeper into the rainforest. What he really meant was that he was afraid of what they might find in a place that existed on no official maps. "There's nowhere else for 50 kilometers, she said firmly, "and we're running low on fuel." Santos muttered something in Portuguese that didn't sound like agreement, but he began his descent anyway. The helicopter dropped through layers of mist, branches scraping against the landing skids as they touched down in the small clearing with barely meters to spare on either side. As the rotors wound down, the jungle's symphony rushed in to fill the silence. Howler monkeys in the distance, the electric buzz of insects, and beneath it all, something else. A low humming that seemed to come from the earth itself. Maya was first out, her bare feet silent on the forest floor. The air here felt different, charged with an energy that made her skin tingle. Behind her, Chen struggled with his equipment while Santos remained in the cockpit, clearly planning to stay with his aircraft. "How far?" Chen asked, shouldering his pack loaded with sensors and sampling equipment. Maya closed her eyes, feeling for the pull she'd sensed growing stronger with each mile of their approach. The forest was calling to her in ways she couldn't explain to the scientist, in a language older than words. 2 kilometers, she said, maybe less. They set off through undergrowth that seemed to part before Maya's steps. Chen stumbled along behind her, his expensive hiking boots catching on roots and vines that somehow avoided Maya's path. The humming grew stronger as they walked, and Chen's instruments began registering readings that made him stop every few hundred meters to recalibrate. "The electromagnetic field here is off the charts," he muttered, staring at his tablet. "And these atmospheric readings. It's like the very air is alive." Maya didn't respond. She could feel it now, the presence she'd sensed from the moment they'd entered this part of the forest. Something vast and patient and utterly familiar. Her grandmother's stories echoed in her memory, tales of the forest's heart where the spirits of all living things converged. The trees began to change as they walked deeper. Their bark took on an iridescent quality, shifting from brown to deep green to silver as the light hit them. Flowers bloomed in impossible colors, blues that seemed to glow from within, purples that shifted like oil on water. Chen stopped altogether when he spotted an orchid the size of a dinner plate that pulsed with bioluminescent veins. "This shouldn't exist," he whispered, reaching for his camera. "The energy requirements alone." "Don't," Maya said sharply, catching his wrist before he could touch the flower. "Not yet. We're guests here." They climbed a ridge thick with ferns that reached above their heads, each frond seeming to track their movement with subtle shifts. At the crest, Maya stopped abruptly. Below them stretched a valley that defied comprehension. The spiral pattern they'd seen from space was even more incredible from ground level. Massive trees grew in perfect mathematical curves, their canopies interwoven to create a living mandala that pulsed with gentle light. At the center rose a tree so enormous that Maya had to crane her neck to see its crown disappearing into the clouds above. "My God," Chen breathed beside her. "The biomass alone, the carbon sequestration potential. If we could understand how this works." Maya barely heard him. She was walking down into the valley, drawn by a pull so strong it felt like gravity itself. The humming was everywhere now, resonating in her bones, calling her home to a place she'd never been but somehow remembered. As her feet touched the spiral's outer edge, the entire forest seemed to take a breath. Flowers bloomed in cascading waves of color. Butterflies rose in clouds of living jewels. And from somewhere deep in the earth, or perhaps from the massive tree at the center, came a sound like singing. Maya smiled through her tears. She had found it at last. The heart of the forest her grandmother had promised would survive everything. The helicopter's rotors cut through the humid air as Marcus Chen pressed his face against the window, watching the endless green canopy stretch below. Beside him, Dr. Sarah Reeves clutched her research tablet, satellite images of the anomaly glowing on the screen. The pilot's voice crackled through their headsets, barely audible over the engine noise. 20 minutes to the coordinates," he announced. "Weather's holding, but we've got storms moving in from the west." Sarah leaned toward him, her voice tense. "The latest readings are off the charts. Whatever's down there is pulling nutrients from a radius of 50 square kilometers. It's like the entire ecosystem is feeding into this one location." Through the windscreen, Marcus spotted the first sign, a subtle shift in the forest's color, deeper greens giving way to an almost luminescent emerald. The trees below grew taller, their canopy so thick it blocked out the forest floor entirely. "There," Sarah pointed ahead. 2 o'clock. Marcus followed her gaze and felt his breath catch. Rising from the jungle like some ancient temple was a living cathedral of trees, their trunks twisted together in impossible spirals that reached toward the sky. Vines hung between them in geometric patterns, creating walls and chambers that pulsed with an otherworldly light. "My God," the pilot whispered. "What is that thing?" As they circled the structure, Marcus caught glimpses of movement below, figures walking along what appeared to be elevated pathways woven from living branches. The entire complex seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with a rhythm that reminded him of a heartbeat. "There," Sarah grabbed his arm. "The clearing to the south, that's our landing zone." The helicopter descended through layers of mist that seemed to shimmer with an unusual phosphorescence. Marcus noticed his instruments acting strangely. The GPS flickered, and his satellite phone showed no signal despite being in previously covered territory. They touched down in a clearing carpeted with luminescent moss that seemed to respond to their presence, glowing brighter where their feet made contact. The air tasted different here, richer, almost electric with life. Every breath felt like drinking liquid energy. "Stay close," Marcus instructed as they unloaded their equipment, "and document everything. If this goes sideways, the world needs to know what we found." Sarah was already taking readings, her instruments registering impossible levels of biological activity. "Marcus, the oxygen content here is 30% higher than normal, and these electromagnetic readings, it's like the entire area is generating its own field." A rustling in the undergrowth made them freeze. From the wall of vegetation stepped a figure that made Marcus question his sanity. The woman was clearly human but changed. Her skin had a subtle green tint, and her hair seemed to move with a life of its own, small flowers blooming and fading among the dark strands. Her eyes held an intelligence that was both familiar and utterly alien. "You came," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate with the forest itself. "I wondered if you would." Marcus found his voice. "Who are you?" Sarah stepped forward, her scientific mind racing. "The satellite images, you created this place?" "Created?" Yanira tilted her head, considering. "No, I simply listened. The forest has been trying to tell us something for centuries. It took losing everything for me to finally hear." She gestured toward the living cathedral behind her, and Marcus saw that what he'd taken for random movement was actually organized activity. People, if they could still be called that, tended to gardens that grew in 3 dimensions, their crops spiraling up living towers that reached toward filtered sunlight. "Nascimento Corporation destroyed my village, murdered my family, poisoned our rivers," Yanira continued, her voice carrying both sorrow and something harder. "They believed they were claiming dead resources. They were wrong. The forest is not passive. It simply needed someone willing to bridge 2 worlds. Marcus felt a chill despite the humid warmth. "What do you want?" Yanira's expression grew serious, and the very air around them seemed to still. "I want them to understand what they've awakened. Your satellites see only the beginning. What grows here will spread, Marcus, not as conquest, but as healing. The earth is tired of being wounded." Thunder rumbled overhead, though no storm clouds were visible through the canopy. The bioluminescent patterns around them began to pulse faster, more urgently. "The real question," Yanira said, her eyes reflecting light like a cat's, "is whether humanity will accept the cure." The helicopter's rotors carved through the humid air as Maya watched the canopy rush beneath them. Her fingers traced the rough bark sample in her pocket, a fragment of the massive trees that now formed a protective barrier around what remained of her ancestral home. The pilot's voice crackled through her headset, announcing their approach to the coordinates she'd provided. "There," she pointed ahead. "Set us down in that clearing." As they descended, Maya could see figures emerging from the tree line. Her heart clenched as she recognized the weathered faces of her people, survivors who had found refuge in this hidden sanctuary after Meridian Corporation's destruction. Children she remembered as toddlers now stood tall beside elders whose eyes held the weight of loss and hope in equal measure. The helicopter touched down, and Maya stepped onto soil that felt alive beneath her feet. The earth here pulsed with an energy she'd never experienced before the convergence, before the forest itself had awakened to protect what remained of her world. Elder Amara approached first, her gnarled hands reaching for Maya's face. "Child of 2 worlds," she whispered in their native tongue, "you've brought strangers to our sanctuary." "They're not strangers anymore, grandmother. They're allies." Maya turned as Dr. Sarah Chen and Marcus Rivera emerged from the aircraft, followed by 2 members of the research team who had insisted on documenting everything. "The satellite images don't do it justice," Sarah breathed, pulling out her instruments. "The biodiversity here is off the charts. These growth rates should be impossible." Marcus was already taking photographs, his camera clicking rapidly. "The UN delegation is going to need extensive documentation. This could change how we approach conservation globally. Maya led them deeper into the settlement, where traditional huts stood alongside structures that seemed to have grown rather than been built. The trees themselves had shaped into dwellings, their living wood forming walls and roofs that breathed with the forest's rhythm. "How?" Sarah asked, running her hand along a wall of living bark. "How is any of this possible?" "The forest chose to protect us," Maya replied simply. "When Meridian's machines came back after I disappeared, when they tried to finish what they'd started, the trees fought back. The very ground rose up to swallow their equipment." Sarah's scientific mind struggled with the explanation. There has to be a rational cause, symbiotic relationships, chemical communications between root systems, perhaps some form of— "Perhaps," Maya interrupted gently, "some things exist beyond the boundaries of your instruments." They were led to the heart of the settlement, where a massive cecropia tree towered above all others. Its trunk was easily 30 feet in diameter, its canopy blocking out the sky. At its base, a natural amphitheater had formed where the roots created seating areas. "This is where it began," Maya explained, "where I first felt the forest's consciousness touch mine, where I learned that the destruction of indigenous lands isn't just an environmental crisis, it's a spiritual one." Marcus lowered his camera, suddenly understanding the gravity of what he was witnessing. "The Meridian executives need to see this. The world needs to see this." "Which is why you're here," Maya replied. "But first, you need to understand what you're really documenting. This isn't just about saving trees or protecting biodiversity. This is about recognizing that the forest itself is a living entity with rights, with consciousness, with the power to defend itself when pushed too far." As if in response to her words, the great tree's leaves rustled without any wind. Flowers began to bloom along its trunk in spiraling patterns, releasing a sweet fragrance that seemed to carry whispers of ancient wisdom. Sarah's instruments were registering readings that defied explanation, electromagnetic fields, chemical signatures, energy patterns that suggested a form of neural network spanning the entire forest floor. "The mycelial connections," she murmured, understanding beginning to dawn. "The fungal networks that connect root systems. But this is more complex than anything we've documented. It's as if the entire forest is functioning as a single organism." "Because it is," Maya said, "and it's tired of being treated as a resource to be exploited. The question now is whether humanity will listen to what it's trying to say." The sun was setting, and bioluminescent fungi began to glow along the tree trunks, creating a constellation of lights that pulsed in synchronized patterns. In the distance, the sound of Meridian's helicopters grew louder. "They're coming," Maya said, her hand moving instinctively to the bark in her pocket. "Are you ready to help me show them what they're really fighting?" The helicopter's rotors cut through the humid air as Dr. Sarah Chen pressed her face against the window, watching the endless green canopy rush beneath them. Beside her, Marcus Rodriguez gripped his camera equipment, his knuckles white against the black metal cases. Neither had spoken since takeoff from Manaus 3 hours ago. "There," pilot Carlos Mendoza called over the engine noise, pointing ahead. "The coordinates you gave me." Sarah's breath caught. Below them, the forest had transformed into something that defied every principle of botany she'd studied in her 20-year career. Trees spiraled upward in impossible helixes, their trunks twisted like DNA strands, reaching heights that dwarfed even the mighty Cecropia. Vines connected the giants in perfect geometric patterns, hexagons and spirals that formed a living mandala stretching for miles. "Jesus Christ," Marcus whispered, his camera already clicking rapidly. "It's real." The satellite images hadn't lied, but seeing it in person left Sarah speechless. This wasn't random forest growth. This was architecture. Living, breathing architecture that pulsed with an intelligence that made her skin crawl with wonder and terror. "Can you set us down?" she asked Carlos. The pilot shook his head, circling lower. "Nowhere to land. The canopy's too thick and those patterns, they're too regular. My instruments are going crazy up here." Sarah noticed it too, Her GPS flickered between coordinates, and her compass spun wildly. The electromagnetic readings on her field equipment spiked and dropped in rhythmic waves. "There's a clearing," Marcus said, pointing to a small gap in the canopy, about half a mile from the edge of the anomalous growth. "We can rappel down from there." An hour later, Sarah's boots touched the forest floor. The difference was immediate. Here, at the periphery of whatever Yara had created, the very air seemed alive. Flowers bloomed in fast-forward bursts of color, wilting and regenerating in endless cycles. Butterfly wings caught light that shouldn't exist in the deep shade, casting rainbow prisms across the undergrowth. Marcus filmed everything, his voice a steady narration of the impossible. Day 7 of the expedition. We're approximately 800 meters from the center of the anomaly. The biodiversity here exceeds anything on record. I'm observing species that appear to be evolutionary leaps, flowering plants with characteristics of both angiosperms and gymnosperms, insects with wing patterns that seem to shift and adapt in real time. Sarah knelt beside a stream that ran crystal clear despite the sediment-heavy waters typical of Amazonian tributaries. When she dipped her water testing kit into the flow, the chemical indicators changed colors she'd never seen before, deep purples and golds that weren't on any chart. "The water," she called to Marcus. "It's not just clean, it's enhanced. Mineral content that shouldn't exist, pH levels that are impossible for this region." "Someone's watching us," Marcus said quietly, lowering his camera. Sarah felt it too, the sensation of being observed, not by animals but by the forest itself. Leaves turned to track their movement. Flowers opened and closed in sequence as they passed, like a wave of botanical consciousness following their progress. "Yara?" Sarah called out, her voice swallowed by the dense air. "We're not here to harm you, we want to understand." The response was immediate. The forest around them shimmered, and suddenly they stood in a cathedral of living wood. Trees had grown together overhead, forming a vast dome of interwoven branches. Bioluminescent fungi provided a soft, ethereal light that made everything glow like stained glass. At the center of the space, a figure emerged from what Sarah had initially taken for another tree. It was Yara, but transformed. Her skin held a greenish tint, and her hair flowed with what looked like living moss and small flowering vines. Her eyes, once dark brown, now held flecks of gold and green that seemed to shift like sunlight through leaves. "Dr. Chen," Yara's voice carried the whisper of wind through branches. "You've come far to find something that was never lost." "The world needs to know," Sarah said, stepping forward carefully. "What you've accomplished here. It could save everything. Climate change, deforestation, species extinction. This could be the answer." Yara smiled, and flowers bloomed along her arms. The world had its chance to save everything. They chose extraction over preservation, profit over life. Her expression hardened. Some things cannot be shared with those who would destroy them. Marcus had been filming silently, but now he spoke. "The pharmaceutical company, they're coming. Tomorrow, maybe the day after. Corporate security, government officials, they know you're here." The forest around them pulsed, and Sarah felt the ground tremble beneath her feet. Every plant, every tree, every living thing for miles was connected to Yara now. She wasn't just in the forest anymore. She was the forest. The emergency board meeting convened at dawn in the glass-walled conference room 40 floors above Sao Paulo. Marcus Sterling stood at the head of the mahogany table, his usually pristine appearance disheveled from a sleepless night. The satellite images were projected onto the wall-mounted screen behind him, aerial shots of what had once been cleared mining territory, now transformed into something that defied explanation. "The growth rate is accelerating," Dr. Chen announced, advancing to the next slide. "In the past 72 hours, we've documented a 23% expansion of the affected area. The biomass readings are unlike anything in our botanical databases." Board member Patricia Voss leaned forward, her manicured fingers drumming against the table. "How is this possible? We cleared that entire sector 5 years ago, used industrial defoliants. The soil should be depleted." "That's what we thought," Sterling replied, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration. But apparently, we were wrong. The images cycled through different spectral analyses, infrared, thermal, electromagnetic. Each revealed the same impossible truth. A thriving ecosystem had regenerated in defiance of every scientific model they possessed. Trees towered higher than the original rainforest canopy, their root systems creating an intricate network visible even from space. The indigenous woman, Sterling continued, clicking to a new slide. Ayana, our intelligence suggests she's at the center of this phenomenon. Locals are calling her the Forest Mother. General Calderon, their military liaison, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. My men have attempted 3 reconnaissance missions into the area. None have returned with useful intelligence. They report equipment malfunctions, navigational failures. One squad leader claimed the trees themselves were moving to block their path. Trees don't move, Voss snapped. Your men are suffering from jungle paranoia. Perhaps, Calderon replied coldly. But their GPS units were functioning perfectly until they crossed into the affected zone. Their satellite communications went dead. Something in there is interfering with our technology. Sterling pulled up geological surveys from the past week. The mineral deposits we were mining, rare earth elements worth billions, they're still there, but they're deeper now, buried under layers of new root systems and soil that didn't exist 5 years ago. Impossible, Dr. Chen muttered, studying the data. Soil formation takes decades, sometimes centuries. This level of ecological restoration would require... Require what? Sterling demanded. There's something else, Sterling said quietly. He clicked to the final slide, a thermal image taken just 12 hours ago. Deep within the regenerated forest, a cluster of heat signatures formed intricate geometric patterns. These aren't random, they're organized. Structured. A settlement? Voss asked. More than that. Look at the positioning relative to the mineral deposits below. Sterling used a laser pointer to highlight the correlation. They're directly above our most valuable extraction sites, every single one. The implications hit the board members simultaneously. If Ayana had somehow gained knowledge of their mining locations, if she was deliberately protecting those specific areas through some unknown means, then this wasn't just an environmental anomaly, it was strategic resistance. We need those minerals, Voss stated flatly. The lithium alone is worth $3 billion. Our shareholders won't accept that we've been outmaneuvered by one indigenous woman hiding in the jungle. She's not hiding, Dr. Chen said, still studying the thermal readings. She's building something. These patterns suggest a level of organization that would require dozens, maybe hundreds of people working in coordination. But our intelligence reports indicate she entered the forest alone, Calderon protested. 5 years ago, yes. But look at these heat signatures. They're clearly human settlements, connected by what appear to be elevated pathways through the canopy. Someone is helping her. Sterling felt a familiar knot forming in his stomach, the same sensation he'd experienced 5 years ago when they'd first encountered resistance from Ayana's village. He'd thought destroying her community would end the problem permanently. Instead, it had apparently transformed her into something far more dangerous. Options, he said curtly. We could attempt negotiations, Dr. Chen suggested. Offer compensation, relocation assistance for whatever community she's established. Voss laughed harshly. After what we did to her original village, she's not interested in negotiations. Then we force the issue, Calderon said. Bring in specialized equipment, environmental suits that can't be compromised by whatever's interfering with our technology. Clear the area permanently. And if we can't? Sterling asked quietly. The question hung in the air like a challenge none of them wanted to acknowledge. Outside the conference room windows, Sao Paulo stretched endlessly toward the horizon, a testament to human dominance over nature. But deep in the Amazon, something was growing that threatened to upset that fundamental balance. The helicopter's rotors churned the canopy as Maya watched the last of the corporate security forces retreat into the distance. Below her sanctuary, The impossible fusion of ancient wisdom and living technology pulsed with renewed vigor. The trees themselves seemed to exhale in relief, their bioluminescent networks flickering like a vast neural system awakening from a nightmare. Dr. Sarah Chen stood at the edge of the clearing, her scientific instruments forgotten at her feet. The readings she'd taken defied everything she understood about biology, chemistry, and physics. The mycelial networks weren't just communicating, they were computing, processing information at speeds that made quantum computers look primitive. And at the center of it all was Maya, no longer fully human, no longer entirely other. The satellite images barely captured a fraction of this, Sarah whispered, her voice filled with awe and terror. Maya, what have you become? Maya's form shifted, bark-like skin smoothing into something more recognizably human as she approached. The transformation was fluid, natural, as if she existed in multiple states simultaneously. I became what was necessary, she replied, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate from the forest itself. When they destroyed my village, when they poisoned the river that gave us life, I had to choose. Die with the old world or become part of something new. The journalist, Marcus Rivera, emerged from behind a massive cecropia tree, his camera hanging useless around his neck. No lens could capture what he was witnessing. The way reality seemed more flexible here, how the boundaries between organism and environment had dissolved into something unprecedented. The world needs to know about this, he said, though his voice carried uncertainty. But they'll never believe it. They'll send armies. They already tried, Maya said, gesturing toward the retreating aircraft. But this isn't something that can be conquered or contained. It's evolution itself, accelerated by necessity and guided by wisdom older than their civilization. A low rumble echoed through the forest as the ground beneath their feet responded to some unseen signal. Roots emerged from the earth, not aggressively, but with deliberate purpose, forming a living amphitheater around them. Maya moved to the center, her connection to the forest allowing her to orchestrate this display with mere intention. 5 years ago, I was dying, she continued, her memories flowing through the mycelial network, shared now with the very trees around them. The chemicals they used to clear the land, the mercury from their mining operations, it was in my blood, in my bones. But the forest spoke to me in my fever dreams. It showed me how everything was connected, how the damage could be healed, but only if someone was willing to bridge the gap between human intelligence and natural wisdom. Sarah's scientific mind raced, trying to process the implications, the carbon absorption rates we measured, the accelerated growth patterns. You're not just healing the forest, you're creating something that could reverse decades of environmental damage. Centuries, Maya corrected. But only if the rest of the world is ready to accept a different way of being. Your people see the forest as a resource to be exploited. They can't comprehend that it's a living entity, a vast intelligence that has been trying to communicate with humanity for millennia. Marcus stepped forward, his journalist's instincts overriding his amazement. What do you want from us? Why reveal yourself now? Maya's expression grew somber, and the forest around them seemed to mirror her mood, the bioluminescent patterns dimming to deep blues and purples. Because time is running out. The tipping point approaches, not just for climate change, but for the planet's ability to sustain complex life. The forest has shown me the calculations, the projections. Without intervention, without a fundamental shift in how humanity relates to the natural world, there will be no recovery. The implications hung heavy in the humid air. Sarah felt the weight of her own research, her papers and publications that had largely been ignored by policymakers and corporations, focused on short-term profits. The security forces will be back, she said, with more firepower, more determination. They see you as a threat to their entire economic model. She extended her hands, and tendrils of living light emerged from her palms, connecting to the root system at their feet. Suddenly, Sarah and Marcus could feel it. the vast network of consciousness that stretched for thousands of miles, connecting every tree, every plant, every microorganism in an intricate web of mutual support and shared intelligence. "I'm offering them a choice," Maya said, her voice now carrying the whispered wisdom of countless species. Evolution or extinction, partnership or perpetual war against the very systems that sustain all life. The forest held its breath, waiting for humanity's answer. The canopy above shimmered with an otherworldly light, as Maya stood at the heart of what the world would soon know as the greatest discovery in human history. The bioluminescent network she had cultivated over 5 years pulsed with gentle rhythms, each tree connected to the next through an intricate web of modified root systems and symbiotic fungi. Dr. Sarah Chen knelt beside one of the massive cecropia trees, her scientific instruments detecting electromagnetic patterns that defied conventional botany. "The cellular regeneration rate is unprecedented," Sarah whispered, her voice filled with awe. "Maya, this could revolutionize medicine, agriculture, even climate restoration." Behind them, the sound of approaching helicopters grew louder. Victor Mendoza's corporate mercenaries had finally tracked them to this sacred grove, just as Maya had known they would. She had spent months preparing for this moment, understanding that her creation would either save or damn everything she held dear. "How long do we have?" asked James Rodriguez, the investigative journalist whose satellite images had first revealed the anomaly. His camera hung ready around his neck, prepared to document whatever happened next. Maya closed her eyes, feeling the pulse of the forest through her bare feet. The trees whispered their ancient secrets, and she listened as she had learned to do in those first desperate months after losing everything. "They'll be here within minutes, but the forest is ready." The indigenous survivors who had joined her cause emerged from the shadows. Men and women from a dozen different tribes, united in their determination to protect what Maya had built. They carried traditional weapons alongside modern ones, their faces painted with patterns that seemed to glow in the bioluminescent light. "You don't have to stay," Maya told them. "This fight isn't yours." An elderly shaman named Joaquin stepped forward, his weathered hand touching the nearest glowing tree. "This forest has always been ours, daughter. Your gift has awakened what was always sleeping here." The helicopters circled overhead, their searchlights cutting through the canopy. Ropes dropped, and armed figures began descending into the grove. Victor Mendoza's voice boomed through a megaphone. "You're surrounded. Surrender the biological assets and no one gets hurt." Maya laughed, the sound echoing strangely through the luminescent trees. "He still doesn't understand," she said to Sarah. "He thinks this is something he can own." The first mercenaries hit the ground, their boots sinking into soil that seemed to pulse with life. Immediately, the forest responded. Vines erupted from the earth with impossible speed, not attacking but simply growing, creating barriers and pathways that herded the intruders away from the central grove. The bioluminescence intensified, becoming almost blinding. "What the hell?" one of the mercenaries shouted before his radio equipment began sparking and failing. The electromagnetic field generated by Maya's creation was interfering with their technology. Sarah's instruments were going haywire. "The entire grove is acting like a single organism," she breathed. "The trees are communicating, coordinating their response." More helicopters arrived, but as they attempted to hover over the grove, something extraordinary happened. Spores, glowing like tiny stars, began rising from the trees in massive clouds. The helicopter's engines coughed and sputtered as the spores interfered with their mechanical systems, forcing them to retreat to a safe distance. Victor Mendoza himself rappelled down from the last functioning aircraft, his expensive suit incongruous in the mystical setting. He landed heavily, flanked by his remaining bodyguards, their weapons trained on Maya and her companions. 5 years, he said, advancing toward her. 5 years you've hidden this from us. Do you have any idea how much money you've cost Meridian Industries? Maya stepped forward, unafraid. The trees around her pulsed brighter, responding to her emotions. "Money," she repeated. "Even now, faced with this miracle, all you can think about is profit." "This miracle belongs to the company that invested in this region," Victor snarled. "My scientists will study it, replicate it, and bring its benefits to the entire world." "Your scientists," Maya said softly, "will never understand it, because they'll never listen to it." She placed her palm against the nearest tree, and the entire grove erupted in brilliant light. The mercenaries stumbled backward, temporarily blinded, but Maya wasn't attacking them. Instead, she was opening a channel, connecting the grove to the vast network of rivers, trees, and underground root systems that stretched across thousands of miles of Amazon rainforest. What happened next would be witnessed by satellite feeds and news crews around the world. The bioluminescence began spreading outward from Maya's grove like ripples in a pond, racing along river networks and tree lines faster than any natural phenomenon should move. Within hours, vast sections of the Amazon began glowing with the same ethereal light, creating patterns visible from space that spelled out a message in dozens of indigenous languages, the forest remembers. As the light faded to a gentle, sustainable glow, Maya turned to face Victor one last time. "The choice is yours now," she said. "You can try to destroy this and lose everything, or you can learn to listen to what the forest has been trying to tell us all along." The age of partnership between humanity and nature had finally begun.